the idea that there's sort of a kind of a mystique around this, that we're not supposed to really know. We know that there's not enough money for us, but there seems to be plenty of money for other things. So I'm going to just share my screen for a second. And one of the things that Dana and I have been working a lot on is connecting these questions around where does university money, where does it come from and where does it go, and how come it never sticks with the students and the workers is one of the questions that kind of has brought us together and has helped us center our attention on these questions of institutional debt. So most of us are familiar with student debt and the idea that students take on tons and tons of money to pay for college, but universities are also taking on debt. And part of when we think about this student debt problem is it's also because the universities themselves are in debt and they turn to students to help service their debt. Whoa, it's kind of crazy. So just to back up for a second, institutional debt is basically the aftermath of years and years and years of state and federal budget cuts. So in response to having insufficient funds from state and local and federal governments to keep doors open, universities have to increasingly turn to debt, like a credit card, to be able to furnish their operations. So, this is part of what the economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck talks about as a transition from a tax state to a debt state. And what he means by that was that there had been a period of time when the United States furnished education. College people used to be able to go to college and pay for it on a summer job because the universities were funded by the government, and the government got those funds by collecting taxes. Now the corporate tax rate, the tax rate on the ultra wealthy is at sort of all-time lows. And so that money that used to come in is now being replaced by debt. But the philosophy of the debt collective and our work is to view debt as a form of extraction. And it's this idea that it's taking resources from people to achieve, exactly as Jen was saying, things that were just people are doing to try to make a life for themselves, and it actually takes resources and sets us back. It's a kind of extraction. And one of the ways in universities that this extraction, the kind of technical term for this extraction, is called debt servicing. So when an institution services its debt, it means it pays back part of the loan that it borrowed, and it also pays back interest and fees to the banks that lend it money. So what this means, just sort of in a general sense, is like when a university wants to borrow money, what they do is they go to banks, they go to creditors, and they try to figure out how to get a loan. That loan, as many of us know, anybody here who's borrowed money knows that a loan will come with all kinds of interest and oftentimes a lot of fees. In the case of big loans and bonds, often as this kind of lending situation works, is they have to go through an underwriter. So the underwriter is kind of like the matchmaker between the borrower and the banks. And the underwriter is also, fees are going out from the borrower to the underwriter and the creditor. But one of the ways that these fees get determined is because of another person, that's another player that's involved in this. And that's the role of credit rating agencies. So credit rating agencies, they basically have one job and one job only, which is to determine who could possibly default on a loan. And they come up with a whole set of metrics to figure out who is a worthy person to lend money to and who's a not worthy person to lend money to, or in the case of institutions, who's a worthy institution and not worthy institution. And universities, in order to make sure that they have the lowest interest rate on the funds that they need to borrow, will basically do everything that the credit ratings agency says in order to maintain a low credit rating. So I'm going to back up for a second. So Moodys is like one of the premier investor services, and they have a rating methodology. You can go and look up the chart that they use to figure out what interest rate to lend money what sort of caliber, what credit rating an institution should have. Some of the factors that they look at are actually really similar. So I think everybody here has been in a classroom at one point or other. and understands what a report card does. Myself and other folks here perhaps who teach as well. And when I give grades to students, I oftentimes use a grading rubric. And I use this rubric as a way to both incentivize the behavior that I want my students to exhibit and also to evaluate them. So if I want to read essays that have a topic sentence, I like put that in the rubric, like does the essay have a strong topic sentence? Do they have topic sentences? Is there a thesis on the first page? Is there correct grammar? Because I'm trying to incentivize this behavior, but then I can go backwards and figure out like, well, how well did my students do on this? And that kind of rubric is like almost exactly the formula for a credit report. And it right down to the actual formatting of it. A credit report is almost always for an institution's credit goes from AAA is like the best borrowing conditions that you can have is to be rated AAA, all the way down to they don't mess around. I think after like B or like little b, it just goes to junk. Like they don't mess around. They're just like anything after a certain level is just junk. So what the Moodys puts on their credit rating, their scorecard, their rubric, if you will, is some of the things that they care about are how well, how quickly, how much power does a university administration have to unilaterally raise tuition and fees? For the raising tuition and fees, at the University of Wisconsin, oftentimes the legislature is part of how the tuition gets set. So from the point of view of Moodys, that's a really, that's like not an attractive institution to loan money to, because if there was to be sort of a budget crisis, it would have to be incumbent on the legislature getting Democratic approval to sort of change the tuition rate. It's a whole hassle. So they don't want to see that kind of like Democratic decision making. That's a big red flag for Moodys. They just want to be able to see a swift increase in tuition. They also really care about who sits on the board of directors at an institution, and they specifically reward boards of directors that have high levels of financial expertise. So if you look at your college or a local college or university's website and go to find the board of directors, board of regents, whatever they're called, chances are that you're going to see a lot of investment bankers. You're probably going to see some corporate lawyers. You maybe will see some like hedge people who have a lot of capital. And this is because this is a priority for Moodys. They want to be, they're less concerned that the university is managed by people who understand pedagogy, who are committed to the community, who care about good education. They want to know people that are going to be able to manage the finances. They also use this sneaky term. They say, does an institution have the ability to take decisive action to preserve fiscal equilibrium? That's code word for the ability to lay everybody off when there's not enough money. And one of the things that they look at precisely with that is how strong labor protections are on a campus and tenure protections. If laying off a bunch of workers is going to cause headaches with unions, if you have to go through tenure procedures, that's a liability from the point of view of the credit rating agencies. So all of these things, we can think about administrators that are hostile to workers. We can think about, I'm from Wisconsin, where we've had a massive attack on public education from a really nasty governor who basically hated everything to do with the public universities, public education. But at the end of the day, once I started learning about institutional debt, I realized that the problems that were faced, the budget cuts and the attacks on the university, was not simply the product of a bad politician. It was also just the university had to run according to the rules of credit and debt. So that's just a little bit of background of when we talk about institutional debt. What this means, just for a point of view, is that vast, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of university budgets go every year, not to paying for workers or helping students pay tuition, but to pay for the interest and the fees to borrow money for universities. And that's sort of priority number one for universities. If they don't pay their debt, their credit rating declines and they can't borrow more money. So it creates this cycle. And the question that we have that I think we all need to be asking is, how do we change this? How do we make our universities accountable to our students, to our workers, to our communities, and not to our creditors? And I'm going to pass it off to Dana, who's going to walk us through, help us think through some of these questions.
Thank you so much. Every time you do this, I swear it gets better. So good job, Eleni. So I'm going to share my screen as well and give a little bit of kind of a personal context to this, because, you know, we were asking you all what you know about university finances, and not surprisingly, like, we all led with our experiences, right? And like what consequences that university finances have had on us. And so in the Pennsylvania state system, which is an example I'm going to be talking about today, we have a situation where this reality of university debt financing, and in particular, the relationship that Eleni was just talking about, has caused, I believe, a lot of the turmoil we're undergoing. So I'll give a quick overview of the state of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania state system, which has, as you can see in this image here, 14 schools, as well as some things that are going on currently and how debt plays a role in this. And then hopefully we'll draw some connections to your own experiences, your own local scenarios, and what some folks have been doing to fight back against this. So as I said, the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, or PASHE, was really founded in 1982. All of these institutions have much longer histories, but they were sort of like pooled together in PA Act 188 in 1982. And it's expressly written in this act, which still stands today, that the state system of higher education serves the purpose to provide high quality education at the lowest possible cost to the students. However, like most states in the US, the PA state system now relies more on student tuition dollars for its operations than it does on state funding. So it's about 75% of higher education funding in PASHE comes from students. I am an alumni of Westchester University, where I currently teach, and I had a professor of mine who was as well. He was towards the end of his career when I was an undergrad there, and he told me, much like Eleni said, that he worked at an ice cream shop over the summer and paid for his tuition for the year. I, of course, left with over $20,000 in debt, and students in Pennsylvania today leave with some of the highest debt totals in the country, over $38,000. Perhaps not surprisingly, in this context, a lot of the enrollment numbers in the PA state system have dropped, particularly from low and middle income students. You know, there's a lot of information out there that shows that you know, upper income students have continued to enroll in the PA state system, but as it's become less affordable, low and middle income students have not been enrolling. Now, the really big change that took place in the PA state system was around 2010, 2011, when then Governor Tom Corbett cut just millions and millions of dollars out of the state fund for the higher education system. We received, you know, a governor in 2018 that pitched himself as kind of like the education governor, Tom Wolf. Yet, as you can see, we are still not at funding levels pre-recession. PA is the second lowest state per capita in terms of higher ed support. And adjusted for inflation, if we were funding the state system as we did back in 1999, which had similar levels of enrollment to what it has today, we would have over $684 million. So we are hundreds of millions of dollars below where we need to be, which has represented about a 30% cut over the last 10 years. And as Eleni was saying, this has consequences, right? So a lot of this is funneled onto students when the state funding is not there. So as I mentioned, Pennsylvania ranks third highest for student loan debt in the country. Almost 2/3 of all students become borrowers in the state and take out over $38,000 for their degree programs. But also we have a lot of increasing institutional debt in the state system. Debt service, which as Eleni said, is the amount of money needed to make principal and interest payments, has increased 43% in that decade time period, right? Additionally, some schools in particular essentially doubled their debt service in this time frame. This is a screenshot I took from a union slideshow, so sorry it looks ridiculous, but it just shows the percent change in debt service over the past decade for some of the schools. Westchester, which is where I work, all the way to the right, listed as WC, had a 141% increase in debt service. So many of these schools have really had just tremendous amounts of debt service. This represents $122.3 million each year in the state system that goes right to Wall Street banks. The system itself has over $1.2 billion in total outstanding debt. So what does this mean? What has happened because of this, right? As we said, some of the things credit rating agencies love is that when there is a crunch for funds, that these debts still will be paid, and they are still being paid. But as enrollments have decreased, that money has to come from somewhere, and it has not come from state funding, as I showed you. So it is coming from massive cuts. Chancellor Dan Greenstein has proposed what he calls a, quote, redesign of the state system. He likes to use the term right sizing. It's just a fancy word for cutting, right? So in the past year, we've had proposed 113 faculty retrenchments, a freeze on using adjunct labor in a lot of the universities, hundreds of staff furloughs. And of course, some of the institutions are responding by cutting programs and classes, particularly a lot of those in the humanities, social sciences, the arts, the ones that cost, you know, money to support, but are essential to a liberal arts education. Perhaps the thing that drives me the most, to the most amount of anger is the fact that the state system's only historically Black college and university, the first in the country, Cheney University, they're planning to eliminate the library at Cheney. So they will not have librarians on campus, nor a physical library building. The school will be expected to essentially operate with complete remote online services. But perhaps what everyone is fighting for right now in the state system is against the proposed consolidations that Nick mentioned earlier. 6 of the 14 schools, Bloomsburg, Lock Haven, Mansfield, will be condensed into one. California, Edinburgh, and Clarion will be condensed into another. This proposal is to be voted on July 14th or 15th by the Board of Governors of the state system, but they're projecting a lot of consequences from this. Over 1,500 jobs lost, economic devastation for small rural college towns where most of these universities are located, and students forced into online courses to complete programs, because essentially what they're planning to do is cut programs from certain campuses and then share virtually, essentially, some of the courses. So students will either have to travel to another campus, Pennsylvania is a large state, 2+ hours away, or have to take classes online. There's a whole lot more to this, but one of the things that has been coming out in a lot of the discussions about the consolidations are the debt services being paid by the proposed schools to be consolidated, which is around $70 million per year in annual debt service for those 6 schools. Chancellor Greenstein has identified that frequently as the number that is being subsidized from the stronger, quote, schools. He tries to pit the schools against one another, right? So like Westchester University is doing financially pretty well. And he says, all of you are paying for their stuff, right? Like you're paying for these other schools. When in actuality, no, we're paying Wall Street, right? Like that's what's going on here. So the conversation needs to be changed. That $70 million is going to Wall Street, not to the schools. Additionally, Board of Governor member, State Senator Schwank, recently in a conversation we had, identified this debt service as one of the main drivers of the fiscal turmoil of the targeted schools, and has suggested shifting that debt to the state so those schools wouldn't have to pay that debt service. It's been proposed for Cheney University as well. And so we're trying to think about, how to potentially organize around that. But I wanted to pull up this quote here that comes from City University unionist Zoe Hugh, which essentially I think highlights what's going on here, right? Because as Zoe said, it's debt on debt on debt. It's a terrible logic of how this accumulates. To generate more money to pay back its loans, the City University of New York must lay off teachers and raise tuition. When CUNY raises tuition, individual students themselves take out loans to afford the hikes. So at the end of the day, this falls on us, right? Like student borrowers, this falls on faculty, this falls on staff that are losing their positions and their livelihoods. And of course, now we're also starting to see this is falling on communities, right? Like if whole universities are at threat, entire communities hang in the balance. Alumni, right? Like we'll no longer have an institution to turn back to. So this is something that impacts many, many stakeholders in higher ed. And yet the people making the decisions aren't us. But of course, as we mentioned, this is not just a PA problem, right? So some of the things we've been doing over the past couple of months is working with other schools that were committed to joining the Debt Reveal Day. We held this on April 15th to showcase essentially the consequences of institutional debt, what we like to call instructional harm, right? The fact that if we're paying off debts in our universities, we're not paying for faculty positions. We're not paying for extra sections of classes that students can attend. We're not paying for mental health services that students need, or lowering their tuition so they don't have so much debt, right? These are all choices. And so I'll scroll through just some of these. These are just some of the posts that folks did across the country highlighting the consequences of university debt. So we have Colorado, OSU, Oregon State, William Patterson in New Jersey that's having a round of cuts and layoffs right now, Temple University in Philadelphia, let's see here, Montclair State, again, the New Jersey state system struggling. And of course, I just wanted to share real quick some examples, I'll throw this in the chat, of some of our compatriots who are and have organized around this at Salem State University, bringing together students, staff, faculty, communities, starting to recognize that debt is an issue that impacts us all.